there's kind of a subtle but important difference between necessity and choice that I want to talk about for a little bit. You know, it's kind of the difference between telling somebody that they have to change and encouraging them to want to change. We need to recognize the importance of the intention and the motivation with which we do something. Now, consider the difference between something like skipping a meal because you're on a fast, or skipping a meal because you can't afford or don't have access to food. And what the problem is, if we wait for things to change by necessity, is how enduring would those changes be? How long will they last? Again, when the oil embargo happened in the 70s, most people viewed it as a temporary inconvenience and an aberration. And when there was more oil available due to discoveries in the North Sea and Alaska, people just went back to high consumption. The 80s and the 90s and the 2000s are some of the highest consumption years, are the highest consumption years in history. You know, it was Morning America, and people voted for that. As Bill McKibben, the author and climate change activist, recently said, all of a sudden now, it's not morning in America, it's dusk on planet Earth. And so what happened was people viewed this as inconvenience to them, and it wasn't viewed as a part of a longer-term change. For many people, it wasn't about choice, and people went back to the consumption route. Now, returning to the example of Cuba, yes, the majority of Cubans changed their lifestyle in the early 90s when they were forced to by circumstances. But what we learned in Cuba was that had it not been for what we might call early adopters, they would have suffered a lot more during their transition. Because in the 80s, there was a small group of organic agronomists at one of the universities who had been studying sustainable agriculture, which they viewed as a much more secure and sustainable method and sound method of agriculture. And their policy recommendations were, of course, ignored for years. And Cuba went to the industrial path. They had the most rapidly industrializing agricultural system in Latin America. But when the crisis hit, the industrial agricultural model collapsed, and these researchers who had laid a groundwork for the transition to organic agriculture in Cuba were thrust into positions of power and were able to create the total transformation of Cuba's agricultural position in just a few years. So the lesson here for us activists and educators and organizers and perhaps early adopters is that we can't wait for that dire need to change. And the people around us, we can't let them wait either, the people that we have in our communities. Instead, we have to begin our preparing and planning and plotting now. We need to think about the question, if we were thrust into positions of power at our workplaces, at our schools, at our local governments, and our communities, what would we do? What are the first 3 things that you would do if you were put in control of blank, of your company, of your school, of your community? Think about that. So I think it's critical that we begin before the necessity arises. And I think it's critical that we communicate that despite the incredible hardships that we're going to face in this transition, and I think we will face incredible hardships, that our lives on the other side, we could be more happier and healthier, and our lives could be more fulfilling because we have community. In community, we can fill our lives with valued relationships rather than valued possessions, and actually consume less but live better. So in choosing a more favorable future, rather than having a future thrust upon us by circumstances, I think that's how we can make sure that the changes that we make can actually be sustained, because I don't think we're going to get a second chance at this to create it. I don't think that humanity is going to get a second chance to create a society that adheres to the limits of nature. Now, we can no longer, any of us, I don't think, or anybody, not just people who are aware, but anyone, I don't think anybody can claim ignorance of the impact that we have on the planet and of these crises that we face. So I wondered, why is it then that despite all of the educational efforts, all of the good models of low energy living that we perhaps are creating and disseminating, why we're not seeing as much change at the mainstream level? Because we can't claim ignorance. The information is out there. In fact, this saying really strikes me that things are getting better and better and worse, faster and faster. I think that's quite true. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the main reasons why I think people can convince themselves to stay in denial and not take that necessary action to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and I'm going to call these enemies of action. The first enemy of action, I think, is savior mentality, the belief that somebody's going to save us. Now, it could be corporations with some new high technology or governments, which, after all, are supposed to take care of us. I think it's, of course, questionable whether corporations and governments have our best interest at heart. And secondly, I think the inability to respond appropriately at the Hurricane Katrina, for one, demonstrates that really all levels of government would be severely hindered in trying to deal with a nationwide crisis, emergency situation, if they couldn't even deal with one city. But, the question arises, even if they could save us, even if governments and corporations could come in and be the saviors, at what cost would that be? What would the implications for democracy be? Would more dependence on a centralized authority really serve us? And that's what's so powerful, I think, about this movement, is it's about taking responsibility, realizing that we have to save ourselves. And I think it's important that we do this, but not necessarily as individuals. One of the big intergenerational differences that I see, particularly between my grandparents' generation and mine, is that my grandparents believed that corporations and governments would, they had our best interests, that they're going to take care of us. They're looking out for us. And I think that's why the transition to the ultra-consumerist lifestyle was able to be accomplished. How could canned food be bad for us if it's available? As my generation, I think we're the ultra-cynical generation. They believe no one's looking out for them. And as a result, I think that's why we see this kind of reaction that we all need to move out to remote rural areas and get our guns and protect our land. And I think this is another enemy of action because it gives people the impossible expectation that they're going to be able to provide for all of their needs and for their own security. And really the vision of the future is community as community taking care of us and providing our security, which I'm going to talk about. And another thing that I see, especially with the younger generation, is this kind of inability to deal with the hypocrisy that's, of course, implicit in trying to live morally in a modern industrial society, which Aaron was demonstrating last night. We critique the lecturer on climate change who drove to the presentation or the environmentalist who eats meat. And there's this thinking that, it's all or nothing. Either we all go back to the wilderness or we do nothing. That there's really no middle ground. I really feel a lot of people are able to stay in denial by that thinking. And I think it's useful to acknowledge this hypocrisy. It's there. It's certainly there in my life as well. But I think we need to be mobilized by it and motivated by it rather than immobilized by it, and motivated to continue trying to align our lifestyles with our values. Because it's just really hard to live morally in such an immoral society, and that's why we have to change that society. And there are going to continue to be hypocrisies for some time. And I think we need courage to deal with that and to move forward with that. One of my favorite quotations is by Ambrose Redmoon. It says, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than one's fear." He goes on, "The timid presume that it's the lack of fear that allows the brave to act when the timid do not. But to take action when one's not afraid is easy. To refrain when afraid is also easy. But to take action regardless of fear is brave." And I think there's a lot of fear, conscious and unconscious, today. And I think we need to acknowledge that it's there, but move forward. Another problem I see is finding really the sufficient level of action to tell people. The problem is you don't want to make it so daunting that people go into denial and depression and don't do anything, or so easy that, of course, they do too little. We wouldn't encourage people to make a 90% cut in their energy use in the first year. But really, I think most of the solutions being promoted by particularly mainstream environmental NGOs are just not enough. A German architect recently told us, "Incrementalism is death." Because small changes to our way of life or no changes both end up in failure. If we don't reduce our CO2 generation below a certain amount, we're going to trigger runaway climate change. And if we don't reduce our fossil fuel dependence, then we're still going to be vulnerable to shortages of the fuel. And another problem is that people who think that the solution's easy, they're not preparing themselves psychologically for the changes ahead. We hear, top 10 ways to save the environment, change your light bulbs, recycle, and really little discussion of the difficult and yet more transformative solutions. And so people don't make the more transformative solutions because they become complacent after doing those small things. And that's why, we talk about curtailment. And in terms of the vision of the future, we've touched on that a little bit. What I want to offer is community.